Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another Conversations on Retail with on-shelf availability focus. My name is Mike Graen, and I'm your host. And I get to introduce a guy that I have been working with for at least 22 years in the RFID space. And everybody knows him as Senthil. But the interesting thing is nobody knows his last name, because it's like 47 consonants, 17 vowels, and a couple of dashes. So, Senthil, why don't you give us your full name and give us a little background about yourself?
Sounds good, Mike. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast. You had asked for my full name. I realize we have only 60 minutes, so it may be tough getting through. But as I said, most of the folks that know me as Senthil, and pretty much everyone that I grew up with knows me as Senthil. And I do really have a very, very, very long last name, but it's essentially my dad's name and my granddad's name. So that's pretty much it, So I come from, a system where they, instead of a typical family name, they basically attach your father's and sometimes your grandfather's name. So that's essentially it. And whenever people try to address me with my last name, I'm like, who's calling me granddad? But anyway, nice to be here.
So what is it? We're all waiting. Give us your entire full name. Not when you go to a restaurant and say, who's the name of the table, and you give them this name. What is your full name? Because I don't think most people know that.
No, and then there's not a system that can fit everything as well. So the only place where I have my full legal name is my passport, but every other system, there is not a single system that can fit my full name. So depending upon where you go, whether it's a university, whether it's the driving license, or whether it's an airline reservation, they chop it up. So it's always fun trying to, figure out what part they chopped out. But, my full legal name first name is Senthil Kumar. And the last name is Chinnappa Gounder, which is my grandpa's name, and Periyaswamy, which is my dad's name. And I think it's 40 or 50 characters, but I have not had the time to go through all of it.
Oh my gosh, longest name in the world. Now, I've also seen it as Senthil Gounder P. What is that? It's a derivation.
Again, different people chopping it different ways, right? And, the biggest challenge I had was I don't really pay attention to it. I'm like, yeah, let's have fun with it. As long as people know me as Senthil or the guy with the longest name, that gets me to places. But as Mike, you alluded to, we have known each other for 22 years, and we all started at the University of Arkansas. And one of the amazing things that the University of Arkansas does when you graduate from Arkansas is they put your name on the sidewalks. It's called the State Walk, right? So, and I got 2 degrees from Arkansas. One was my master's and one was my PhD. And at both of those instances, they came back and said, hey, we can't put your whole name in a sidewalk because our sidewalks are only 6 feet long. You got to chop it up, and that was the longest and hardest I had to think of. Do we get more of my father's name or do I get more of my grandfather's name? And that's why I had to get my PhD too, because when I got my master's, I had to give it for my grandfather. But then I felt bad for my father, so I had to go and get a PhD to, get him in. So I'm there twice on the sidewalks of Arkansas, but 2 different versions.
On most of the 6x6 squares at Arkansas, there's 150 names. On yours, there's 1. It has to tap around 14 times to be able to get it. So, well, let's get in a little bit of the podcast. That's always fun to talk a little bit about the fun part of your name and stuff. And I always tease you. But we had a board meeting a couple weeks ago, and you also said Senthil, and I go, "What's your last name?" I thought about yelling that out. Yeah, that's not fair. So, 2005 to 2005. You and a guy by the name of Justin Patton were, I think, relatively new out of school, and Dr. Bill Hargrave came and said, hey, why'd you like to come and be part of an RFID lab? And you went, a what? So tell us about you and the lab, and what exactly does the lab do? I think a lot of people have heard of the Auburn RFID lab. I'll bet you that most of them don't know everything that you do, but just talk a little bit about what you do at the lab.
Yeah, so we got started at the lab when we were still students at Arkansas. So I was getting my master's at that time. Justin was almost done with his master's at that time. And I was in computer science. He was in computer engineering. And Dr. Hargrave was in the business college. And, and he has been working with Walmart for a couple of years at that point, trying to figure out, hey, will this technology be relevant to what Walmart is trying to solve from a business perspective. And around 2005, they had arrived to the conclusion, yes, there is, value in this technology. This technology is feasible. So let's try and make this as a reality. And at that point, Dr. Hargrave and the team at Walmart decided, hey, it would make sense to create an RFID lab that would serve as an educational resource to the community, to the suppliers, to the technology providers that are getting on board, really quickly, and also do some of the fundamental research that's required on the business side. And at that time, he basically reached out, to us and said, "Hey, do you guys want a job?" And we were like, "Oh, okay. Is it a paid job?" And the answer was yes. And we said, "Yeah, we are up for it, right?" So, we are hungry grad students, and we started in the lab in 2005, it has been a short 19 years. We didn't really think we would be doing this for 19 years because in a typical academic environment, you work on a research project for 2-3 years, wrap it up and move on to the next thing. But with RFID, it has been a fantastic journey where we have sort of grown with the industry, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And we were at University of Arkansas for the first 9 years, and then we moved to a place called Auburn University, and we have been there for officially 10 years now. So we have now been longer in Auburn than in Arkansas, but it doesn't feel like it. The early days were, I would still consider the early days a way lot more fun than today. Today we're still having a lot of fun, but the early days we were literally, building things in the lab. The role that we have played in the industry has sort of evolved as the industry has evolved, but the core mission of the lab, which is to focus on the business case and the business value of the technology, educating the community both on the business and the technology side, and then serve as a platform for everyone to sort of come together and work. And then one of the things that we have been doing, not really quite for 20 years, but more for the past 15, 16 years, is do a lot of things that helps with the implementation of the technology as well. Because early in the days, we figured out our role was pretty, we thought, hey, once we see the value, once people make the decision, we thought our work was done. But we were realizing that there is a lot more work that happens while you deploy this technology and roll this out than, even in the initial decision of choosing something like RFID. So we have focused a lot on that, and here we are.
Here we are. So your role specifically,
Yep.
Here's the way I like that. Rather than giving us a 20-minute dissertation about your role description, what typical day looks like for you. Because what I would say is you are the technical expert. You probably don't really like to be referred to that, but when somebody wants to know how RFID really works, they don't ask anybody at the lab except you. Tell us how this works, right? So give us the understanding of this. So what does a typical day look like for you? And weave into that kind of what's the role that you have at Auburn?
Absolutely, Mike. So my official title is Director of Research and Technology. But as you refer to, whenever there is a tech question, hey, let's ask Senthil, is not unusual. My typical day, it serves, let me step back a little bit as well. So when we started the RFID lab, the mission has always been to support the business case and the business value. But, someone like me and even Justin come from an engineering background, right? So we learned technology growing up, and it's still our passion. So what we tend to do is we tend to have a fundamental understanding of what the technology can do, and more importantly, what the technology cannot do. So it's really having that and then working with businesses. And when they come to us with problems they would like to potentially solve with RFID, it's basically guiding them saying, yep, that is feasible. It's something that we can currently do. It has been done. Or it could be something like, hey, this is something that's currently not feasible, but might have a solution in the near future if we really put our efforts to it. Or this is not something that RFID cannot do. And we need to probably look at something else. In that way, we are setting the right expectations, on the end user side. Typically, on a typical day, I sort of look at my role in three different buckets. The first bucket is, I tend to work with a lot of technology companies, both in the mature market space where people have developed technologies and have been using it for years and months at this point, trying to understand how it works. But I also spent an equal amount of time with technology companies that are developing stuff that might not be ready for real time, but is up and coming. And with that interaction, I sometimes we work back with the community, getting them my perspective on what their technology can do, and what are the things they could potentially do that could help fill the gaps. Because a lot of times the technology, especially in the second category where companies are developing technology for an anticipated market need, they have done their market research, they understand their product. But we also tend to work with a broader set of end users. So we give our perspective as well on, hey, these are things that would be a fantastic fit. There is a market need for it. But there are certain things that you might not have focused on, but there is definitely an opportunity there. But then that's probably about 30% of my day, if you will, working with the technology companies. The second, I would say, part of it, the other 30% is I tend to work with end users as well, trying to understand the business challenges that they are trying to currently solve and what do they have down the pipeline. Because, we believe firmly that, technology development for the sake of technology development is not as impactful as developing a technology to match a business need, right? So we do spend a lot of time getting into the weeds of, day-to-day business operations with